Mobile technology and mobile people. How the rise of technology has impacted daily relationships by Christopher. The rise of mobile technology began in World War II. The technology that made cell phones possible was used back then for airstrikes and to contact battalions on the field of battle. The first actual cellular phone call as we know it took place in 1973. Almost 10 years later, the first actual consumer cell phones were released, and those were released by Motorola. They were known as the Dynatac 8000X. Those handsets offered right around 30 minutes of talk time, about 6 hours of battery, and could store up to 30 phone numbers. The cost was $39.95. That's nearly $4,000. Now, in the very early days, mobile handsets weren't exactly consumer driven. They were more for rich Wall Street types, such as Gordon Gekko, the famous Wall Street character. And if you didn't drive expensive fancy cars or exclusively fly first class or on Concords, cell phones weren't exactly for you. But even in the sort of the 90s, that was still the case, up until Nokia really started entering the mobile handset market. 1990 to 1995 represented an upward swerve in design and portability. Mobile devices gradually started to appear in the hands of average everyday consumers, and by the late 90s, a majority of Americans either owned a cell phone or were planning to own a cell phone. The first cell phones that most people really remember using were the Nokia 6100 series back in 1997 and 98. These cell phones included 3 games, Memory, Logic, and everybody's favorite cell phone game, Snake. They included a calculator, a clock, calendar, currency converter, also worked as a pager, and came in 4 different colors. Just a year later, the first actual flip phones came out, inspired by the Star Trek communicators. These were known as StarTAC phones, and there are still people that claim to use them every day. Nokia came out with more and more phones, the 5100 series, which offered longer battery, better cellular technology, still included Snake. It wasn't until the late 90s that RIM, a Canadian cellular company, came out with what would eventually be known as the BlackBerry. First, it was known as the RIM 850, and it was really the first brand that started making people aware of what smartphones would eventually become. Now, while it wasn't called the BlackBerry, it offered all of the advantages of owning what we would consider to be a smartphone. Now, the device itself was really just a personal device assistant. It didn't have the ability to call yet, but its predecessors, the BlackBerry line, did. The BlackBerry 850, or RIM 850 as it was known back then, it was released in 1999, had a 6 to 8 line display and was capable of sending text messages, emails, had calendars, address books, task lists, a calculator, and an alarm function. It was one of the first wireless devices capable of connecting people to corporate email, personal email, and their contacts. At the time, it had a whopping 4 megabytes of memory, and it was actually powered by a 1 AA battery. It also included the QWERTY keyboard that we all know and love. RIM stock, because of this device, actually went up 30%, and 10 years later, RIM would be king of the cell phone companies. We obviously know how that worked out, and eventually they had fallen and given way to Samsung and Apple. Smartphones, as we know them, really first came into being in 2006 and 2007 when the BlackBerry Curve, the model with the trackball that many people consider to be their first smartphone, came out. It became more and more popular as time went on, and morphed from more of a business-friendly device to an all-around consumer device. The BlackBerry Curve actually went on to become the best-selling phone of all time up until the iPhone was released. Later in 2007, Apple released the aforementioned iPhone and has now become the best-selling phone of all time. Google, on the other hand, in 2008 came out with their Android line. Android is actually an operating system, not a phone, and is open source, so it can be used by other corporate partners at no cost to very little cost, depending on the customizations in their contract with Google. Google has taken over the mantle of being the smartphone giant in the world, as their Android operating system is installed on over 1.6 billion devices as of the end of 2004. Because of this, Android owns right around about 70% of the mobile market, with Apple being second and Microsoft being third. The rise of text messaging really took place in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Consider the fact that the first text messages were sent in 1992, and then over the next few years they evolved into something that truly became a phenomenon. The first actual phones with a keyboard, a QWERTY keyboard as we know them, was released in 1997 and was the Nokia 9000i. Now, before social media really took off, there were two ways to communicate with your friends. There was the social media or the online media platforms like AOL Messenger, Yahoo Messenger, and MSN Messenger, or there was text messaging. In 2012 was actually considered the peak of text messaging, with over 7.4 trillion text messages sent. Considering that there are right around 7 billion people on the planet, that's quite a few. Social media messaging, though, is taking over text messaging as the main way to communicate with phones and tablets. As Apple has iMessage, Facebook has Messenger, Twitter you can direct message. There are also some other online media platforms that you can use to send messages instead of texting. Now, social media as we know it really started in 2002 with Friendster. While Friendster never really gained over more than a couple million users, it was really the dawn of a new era almost with online media and online social media platforms. The first real phenomenon was MySpace, which launched in 2003, and at its peak had 75 million users in 2008. Shortly thereafter, it was taken over by Facebook, and Facebook ran away with the crown ever since. Facebook was launched in 2004 on the campus of Harvard by Mark Zuckerberg. It was it was a college-only social media platform. In 2007, when it was opened up to everybody else, is when it really exploded. Facebook now has over 1.5 billion users, right around about a fifth of the world's population, and Mark Zuckerberg himself is worth $35.7 billion. The second, probably most well-known social media platform would be Twitter. Twitter currently has over 200 million users, so still a small percentage of what Facebook uses, but still quite a few. And Twitter was actually instrumental in the Arab Spring uprising a few years ago, as that's the main way that people communicated before those countries cut off internet access. And what the actual numbers and facts say is, according to studies, over 50% of cell phone users prefer text messages over other messaging platforms, such as actually calling. Most people will send a few text messages rather than spend 5 or 10 minutes on the phone. In 2014, as of 2014, 41% of U.S. households cut their landlines and now only use cell phones for calls. And a lot of times people don't actually really use cell phones as phones the majority of the time. Now they are media players and game players, social tools, etc. Even cable television is kind of on a downswing just because you can take your tablet and phone anywhere and watch videos, movies, television shows, etc. Now, how do I feel personally? I think that even though according to studies, people are learning a new way to communicate, I feel it's for the best. These new platforms may seem like they're taking away a person's ability to really communicate, but I feel it's strengthening them in more areas than before social media. While cell phones may have seemingly destroyed face-to-face conversations, I don't really think they have. I feel as though, people will still have those face-to-face interactions, especially as they grow up. And change is not really a bad thing. Usually it's met with resistance, obviously. But in this case, I feel a lot of people are intimidated by the technology. They don't really understand how it works, don't understand how to utilize it to the best of its ability, compared to children that are 10 to 16 years old now who have grown up with this technology and have had it around, for the majority of their lives. I feel that those ages where children really blossom into who they're going to become, those ages like between 10 and 18, I feel as though being connected to their friends more of the time than even when I was a child 15 years ago will be nothing but beneficial to their adult lives. Thank you.